Hello and welcome to another exciting podcast. I'm Alexander Theo Harris.
And I'm Peter Smith. Thanks for having me.
It's your podcast too, man. Today we're going to be talking about a subject near and dear to any lawyer's heart, and that, of course, is negotiation and techniques and tactics around it. We want to make clear this is not legal advice. This is just our opinion. Peter and I are attorneys, but we're not your attorneys. If you do need legal advice, please find a competent attorney in your jurisdiction. This is one of those conversations that is certainly going to be useful for attorneys out there, but I think this is something that's universally applicable. Everybody in their everyday life ends up having conflicts with people, or ends up having times that they need to convince somebody else that this is the way to go forward, or find some sort of compromise somewhere in between.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I did not negotiate with my kids this morning on their way to school about putting on shoes.
How'd that work out?
Well, I didn't negotiate with them at all. No, of course I did. I also didn't negotiate about where to go to eat last night with my girlfriend. No, you're absolutely right. I think negotiation is an everyday skill across professions. It's like sales. I mean, it's something that everybody needs to know how to do.
Mm-hmm. But that said, attorneys in particular need to have a really good skill set in this area, because a lot of what we do, beyond obviously contract drafting and giving advice, is working with other parties and finding some middle ground, or convincing some other party that, hey, this is the way this needs to be, and here's why. So we have certainly spent a lot of time doing negotiations. I think a big chunk of what we do is along those lines in business law. And because of that, we have some techniques that we've adapted over the years. Of course, no technique, and I'm sure you'll agree, Peter, no technique is going to work 100% of the time. I've seen a lot of times that someone will claim, oh, you always need to do this going into a negotiation. This is the most important thing. And the fact of the matter is there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to this. It is feeling out the other parties and seeing what's going to work best.
You know, it's funny because I would agree with that. And I think, the point of this podcast is a little more free-form, free-flowing. We decided not to create some fancy acronym for you to write down and walk away with. I mean, I think, Alexander, you're right. There's no magic bullet for how to be a good negotiator. There's a lot of good sort of techniques that we can talk about. There's no art of the deal. Here's how you get everything done. That's kind of salesy. You know what I mean? That's how to be maybe a good salesman on some of that stuff. And that's a part of negotiation, but it's not the whole, it's one ingredient to the stew. So I think you're right. Okay, go ahead. What do you got for us?
So let's start this with a pretty wide open question. And that is, how do you know you negotiated well?
That's a great question, but I think if everybody walks away a little bit mad, no.
If nobody's happy coming out the other side.
That's a good question. I think for me, I'm an attorney, so typically I'm negotiating on behalf of somebody else. Most of us in our professional lives are doing that for clients, okay? I think if my client is happy and got what they wanted, if they can sleep at night, then I've negotiated successfully. I think, honestly, I also gauge my success on how the other side walks away feeling. Whether they, I don't know if they're winners and losers in negotiations or not, but if the other side walks away feeling like they won, that's okay for me. That's a piece of my success.
I think that's actually really helpful, because if the other side walks out feeling like they won and your side walks out feeling like you won, of course, everybody is happy, which is nice. But if the other side feels that way too, it means that they're that much less likely to contest this down the line or cause problems down the line.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, your read and remind for that piece of it is, when I think of negotiation and for this particular podcast, I thought about, okay, what do I think of when I'm trying to help a client sell a business or buy a business, actually, for that matter? I mean, it's a complicated asset. It's not like you're buying a TV. Buying a business is something there's goodwill, maybe there's employees who come with it. Yeah, sure, there's probably hard assets or equipment or inventory, but there's a lot of intangible pieces that go into it. It's complicated, it's complex. So when I think of negotiation and buying or selling a business, somebody isn't going to sell their business unless it's at the right price, at the right terms, and somebody isn't going to buy it unless it's at the right price and the right terms.
Mm-hmm. Unlike a TV, it's very rare that you sell a business and there isn't some other strings attached. There's typically training and an ongoing relationship. There's something that makes that transition continue. Mm-hmm. So
right, exactly. That's a good point.
It's really important. Unlike, okay, I sold my TV on Craigslist, it's gone now. Mm-hmm. There is going to be some long tail that comes off the end of that where you're going to be continuing to work with somebody on the other side. So having people walk out the other end feeling like they succeeded on both sides really, I think, goes a long way to keeping that relationship going.
Okay, so that's success, but how do you achieve success?
So there's a lot of different tactics you can use to get there, and I think it makes sense for us just to run down some of them that we've used in the past that may work. I think a lot of people, when they hire an attorney, particularly an attorney who's going to be negotiating for them, they expect them to be a bulldog. They expect them to go in and bark a bunch and threaten to bite people, and somehow that's going to get everybody to fall into line.
It doesn't get anything done.
A lot of the time, it really doesn't get anything done. I think there's a time and a place for that, and I'm totally happy to be that bulldog if necessary. But at least at the outset, I've found in a lot of cases, coming in, just being sweet as honey. Coming in, working through, trying to figure out what's going on, and see if there's some peaceful way that you can get things resolved. Even if people are already inflamed, particularly coming in as a lawyer, I think there's an expectation that you're going to come in guns blazing. And if you step in with the opposite mindset, I think you can get a lot of things done.
Yeah, all the best businessmen that I've worked with are the same way. You're catching flies here, right? And you got to use honey to catch the most flies. So I would agree with that 100%.
I sent an attorney in a very embroiled situation. I sent an attorney a letter at one point, and they gave me a ring and said, hey, I wouldn't normally bother calling, but your letter was very courteous, and maybe there is some kind of deal we can reach here. So it opened the door in a place that was otherwise a brick wall to having some sort of conversation.
Yeah, I've got a story like that too. I mean, I've also had an attorney write me a serious nasty gram that incited my client, and then I wrote something similar back because my client demanded. We got to respond in kind. And the attorney called me up and he said, I think there's a reasonable solution here. I said, I think so too. He said, maybe we should tone down the language in these letters. And I said, yeah, that's probably for the best. And from there, we got to a reasonable settlement eventually. So I agree.
I walked into a negotiation at one point and I sat down at the table with my client next to me and the other side on the other side of the table. And that table was about as wide as you could get. There was no opportunity for these two sides to see anything in the same light as the other was seeing it. And I sat down and said, listen, we can go through this and have a really difficult time and bite at each other. But the fact of the matter is, my client wants some pretty simple things, and I think that you want some pretty simple things. So here's what I'm going to do. 75% of the deal points that you're interested in, we're just going to give you. Straight up, regardless of what happens for the rest of this conversation. You guys get these. Can we talk about the remaining items? And you could see the wind just fall out of their sails. It was such a strange experience because they still were full of adrenaline, ready to fight on all these items, but we pulled out all of them. There was nothing left, right? Mm-hmm. And it just became a really non-confrontational conversation about how can we fix the remaining issues. And ultimately, by the end of an hour and a half, we had everything resolved. And I think that had I come in guns blazing as expected, we would have gotten nowhere.
Right. One of the things that I think of is that, humans are always going to try to act in what they perceive to be their best interest. And I think that that's a common theme about how I talk to folks and communicate to the other side. And even to my own client, I'm constantly talking about what's in your best interest. And if you're trying to sell something, then getting it sold is a piece of what's in your best interest. Do you see what I'm saying? So walking away from the deal, from any deal, from not selling it at all. I mean, if you didn't want to sell, you wouldn't sell. So I always think about what's in your best interest, whether I'm trying to negotiate on one little point where I spin it to make it feel like the other side's getting something there and it's truly in their best interest for it. I'm constantly thinking about that. One other thing that I want to mention too is there is a business school phrase that I do talk to my clients about for negotiation called BATNA, your best alternative to no agreement. So a lot of times too, if I feel like things are going astray with my client and they're getting to the point where they're like, you know what, why don't I just not sell anyway? I always talk to them and say, that's fine. Is that really what you want to do here? And the BATNA too is a useful tool where I can help my client think through, okay, if you actually don't sell here, what is the best alternative to not following through in this particular negotiation at this time? And it can help them get to a place where they're comfortable standing firm on terms sometimes and walking away from a deal that's otherwise bad for them. Right? Or helping them to understand that, that alternative is not nearly as good as selling under this term that I'm struggling with.
So, Peter, you're touching on something really interesting there in that our negotiations aren't always on opposing counsel's side. Frequently, our negotiations are with our clients. Mm-hmm. And in part, it's trying to explain to them something that may not be obvious or maybe is obvious but is being obscured by emotions. A lot of times people come in, particularly if they've tried to resolve an issue themselves for some time, and they come in very angry at whoever's on the other side of the table. And it may be against their own best interest to continue doing things the way that they're doing, but they don't care because there's this other emotional aspect to it. Mm-hmm. So attorneys kind of play an interesting role in, we're going to help you get what you want, but maybe we're going to help reframe what it is that you want.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an internal negotiation, right? So there's the external negotiation between the two sides and the two parties, but also whether it's me with my client trying to help them understand and negotiate with them about what they truly want, or if you're listening to this and you're thinking, how am I going to personally be a better negotiator? Internally with yourself. You're negotiating with yourself all the time. What are you willing to give up on? What are you not willing to give up on? You're going to fight like hell for, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've talked about some good theory stuff, but I want to get down to brass tacks. What are the techniques that we use out in the field to help make negotiations go more smoothly? And I think, in my mind, the chief among those is this idea of anchoring. Anchoring is the concept of providing a number or a point or reframing the conversation in such a way that the other party is now beholden to discussing it in that way or has in their mind a particular number. So you provide a number that helps frame the conversation. So typically, if somebody walks in the door and says, hey, I'm looking to buy this building from you and I'm willing to pay $100,000. The other side was expecting to sell it for 150, but now the conversation is anchored at a lower value and the conversation is going to be framed around that. I've seen a lot of people go both ways on this. I've seen people say, hey, you shouldn't be the first one to throw out a number. And I've seen people say, oh, you should always be the first one to throw out a number. Peter, do you have any thoughts on one way or the other?
No, my thought is that anchoring is what's important. You need to be able to set the context for yourself in the best light for your client. So if that means giving the number first, then do that. If it means giving the number second, then do that. Am I making sense? It's an information issue too. If you're thinking, I have no idea how much budget this company has or what they're being willing to offer me or whatever, then anchor by explaining your values, what skills you have to offer and all that stuff, so that the context is around how valuable you can be to the company. And then when they offer you a number, you can go from there. If you have more information and you know what you need to make or whatever, then you can start with the number and start the context from there.
So you're saying anchor around more than just numbers, anchor around the concepts and that reframing to help guide the conversation.
Yeah, so exactly. So the anchor doesn't have to be around something tangible like a number. You can anchor around, I'm the right guy for the job. In fact, there's no one better than me. And if you start anchoring the conversation from that point, you may be just as well off as if you started with the number.
I like it. Another thing that's always super important and is really easy to overlook is that you assume you know what the other party wants. The simplest thing, and it's so valuable, the simplest thing at the start of a negotiation is just asking what the other party is actually looking for. Because too often you come in with these expectations that may be way off the mark. You may be thinking, oh, well, I know that my price point's too high, so I know I'm going to have to negotiate down my price point. I know that I'm going to have to make some concessions on that front. When in reality, the price point may be totally fine to them. The only issue is that they want to make sure the building is repainted, right? So you're doing your client a disservice and you're doing yourself a disservice if you're running the negotiation by not just asking what the other party actually needs.
Right, I think that's fair, and it comes down to something that I was going to highlight here, which is communication and good communication. So, and my thought there was pretty much exactly what you're saying is that there has to be a flow of information at some point, so somebody knows what they're buying or the other side knows what they're getting. And so how you have that information exchange is crucial. It's all about communication, and asking questions is a good way for that. I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, if you don't ask questions, you're never going to know. We all know what happens when you assume, right? So that communication is key, and making sure that it's drizzled with a little bit of honey and that you're fair and reasonable is all part and parcel with how this all works out. So that would be my next point to piggyback on that is you've got to project an air of fairness, because if it's clear that you're trying to, pull the wool over their eyes and hide something, that's not going to get anything done. Or if it's clear that you're trying to gouge somebody or take advantage of them, that's also not going to get the job done.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money. So often people come in and are holding cards really close to their chest, but at some point you need to start giving away a little bit of what it is that you're looking for or helping to showcase this is what we need to do to make this happen. So even if people come in and they're really buttoned up about what's necessary, asking getting that communication flow going is what's going to allow you to reach the compromises you need to finish out a negotiation.
I think that's right. Remember, success for me is to have both sides walk away happy. That's the pinnacle best achievement for me. And if my client's more happy, then that's even better, right? But that's the idea. I think a couple of pieces that I hold on to whenever I'm negotiating is, and this is another sort of MBA business school idea, but it's true, is don't negotiate with yourself. I have a lot of really great clients who are trying to focus on the fairness aspect and the aspect of, I've got to do everything, ethically and honestly and right and correct. And you should absolutely do all that stuff, but don't confuse that with negotiating with yourself, which is where you make an offer, there's a strict set of terms, and you realize, shoot, I probably overshot the mark there, and they're going to, not be happy with that or whatever. So what? Let it lie, let them respond, and then you can go from there. Do not negotiate with yourself. Am I making sense with that?
Totally. Now, I've heard a technique in the past where, particularly to prevent negotiating with yourself, you end up presenting something and then just letting it lie with dead air, even if it's over the phone or in person, just stating it and forcing the other side to respond. Do you have any thoughts on that? Have you used that technique before?
So I have seen that tactic before where you offer something like that and then just leave it with dead air. But I think that that's a part of the discipline of being a good negotiator is you've got to see how the other side responds before you respond in kind.
Okay, another technique I want to mention is what I call the sandwich method, which is where you snuggle something negative in between two good pieces of bread. So this is sort of like, by way of a terrible example, saying like, oh wow, your hair, Peter, looks really nice today. Also, I hit your dog with a car, and I think that's a great shirt. Really like the color, brings out your eyes.
Good. Despite that terrible example, what you're saying is that you might offer two things but request this really significant thing for yourself. So you're sandwiching the two things you're offering that are nice to the other side, and in the middle putting what is ugly, what you want.
Putting the ugly meat right in the middle there. Yeah, so you're giving some small concession, or you're making some small complimentary remarks, giving what is actually the negative and the concerning thing, and then supplementing it at the end with something additional that's also good for the other party. That way, it's not necessarily to mask what it is that you're doing, but I think psychologically it assists in somebody stomaching this sandwich.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's a good idea. Actually, I use that in writing a lot too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good technique for persuasive anything, really, writing or negotiation. So I like to talk about another principle that I try to make sure that I use, and that's the idea that if I'm ever conceding something or giving in on something or changing my position on something that's favorable to the other side, I always ask for something else in return.
I certainly do that as well, and I think it may not even be a tangible thing that you're getting in response. Sometimes I am just looking for goodwill from the other side to sort of pocket for a future issue.
Right. No, that's fair to do. That's fair to say, too. I think overall, that plays into this idea that when I'm negotiating, I want to make sure that I'm projecting an overall air of fairness, right? That everything that we're doing is equitable and it's fair, and there's nothing sneaky happening. And so that idea of exchange is just how I make sure that I'm not overplaying the fairness to, at the risk of my client. I'm always asking for something when I'm being fair. And I think the other side responds to that too, because it seems more fair if you're giving something and getting something.
Nothing will break down a negotiation faster than if they feel like you're not being fair.
Right.
So certainly fairness helps reach a more equitable solution, but I think it's the only way to go forward, because if one side feels like they're being stomped on, they're going to try to get out, or they're going to fight back with their own overarching demands.
Right. I think that's a fair point.
Okay. Let's talk about compromise. So, I think there's an expectation from a client that you're going to go in with all these deal points that you are going to gun for, and you're going to fight about, and you're going to get. And that is very rarely the case in my experience.
You mean to get everything that's on your list?
Yeah, to go straight down the list and say, here, we got everything. Unless there's some other issues that you just totally didn't acknowledge going in the door and didn't realize were also going to be something that you can trade away. You need something to bargain with, right? You give something, you get something.
Right. It's the idea of exchange from before. But I see what you're saying. Just knowing that there's going to be some compromise in there is important. So I used to know a partner that I worked under at the time. And what she would do is she had colored pencils or colored pens. And she would have a red pen, a yellow pen, and a green pen. And she knew that everything in red was something that her client was unwilling to compromise on. Everything in yellow was like a middle ground. And everything in green was tradable.
Oh, it's kind of a fun way to do that.
It is, and she'd take notes that way. But I mean, she was an incredibly organized woman, and I think that's just how her personality worked. But for me, I mean, I get having some things that you're not going to give away. Some red things, I get that. But the yellow and the green stuff, and maybe even the red too, it changes colors. So to put them in colors like that and not being willing to be flexible, I think is dangerous. But if that's what you got to do, that's what you got to do. So a technique that I want to try to put into words, but is difficult for me, is sometimes when I'm negotiating, I like to create this idea of what we're offering or what we're giving is unique. So the idea is that human beings like things that are unique. We're attracted to them, okay? So we're attracted to things that are more unique or are, it's sort of like the shiny object principle, right? We're more attracted to things that are shiny. So knowing that, you try to create this idea of scarcity to get what you want, or present your idea as something that's unique and you can't get it anywhere else, right? We know that humans want to go and get that thing because they feel more special if they got that unique thing. Now, we also know that humans are more likely to do deals with other humans they feel like are similar to them. So I try to balance these two ideas to make something happen. I know that sounds crazy, and the best example I've seen of this is a real estate agent who's trying to sell a home. He or she is constantly trying to make the home they're selling a unique thing on the block, the special, unique flower that nobody else can get. But if there's a bidding war and he's on the buying end and there's a number of offers at the same exact price level, he'll have his clients write letters about what it is they like and what they enjoy doing in hopes that the sellers, the owners of the home, will connect in some way and say, oh, those buyers are like me. They're the same. We're similar. So even though there's been an equal amount of offers, I'm more similar to this person, so I want to do business with them.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I think a lot of the negotiation comes down to personability too, right? If you can make a connection with someone, you can help grease the wheels and get something done. If people are willing to compromise, if people are willing to come to the table and work together, you're more likely to actually accomplish something, right? And certainly being a personable individual and having people be willing to talk with you and willing to make things work is going to go a long way.
So the last thing I want to ask you about, Alexander, is how you work this idea into your negotiation tactics, and that's threats.
Yeah, so we've talked about the honey. We've talked about some of these other tactics for doing it, but what happens when things break down?
Yeah, what about the stick?
So we have obviously a huge advantage being attorneys. We have a lovely tool in our toolkit called letterhead, the scary top to a letter that says this came from a law firm. That in and of itself already opens a lot of doors. But if you have an attorney on the other side who's getting that threat level certainly goes down. So as far as pushing things through and getting a deal made using threats, it comes down to a couple things. One, you need to have a foundation for why your threat is credible. You need to convince the other party, and sometimes letterhead is sufficient for that. But other times, if an attorney's on the other side, you need to convince an attorney that your threat is actually real for legal reasons. Mm-hmm. And two, you need to convey that it would be cost effective for you to pursue that threat, and it's a real possibility that you will move forward on it. So typically that threat comes in the form of, I'm going to sue you. Right. But it could be, I'm going to send you to a debt collector. I'm going to go and approach the media about something that you did.
Interesting. Yeah.
We've seen that even with something as simple as Yelp or Facebook reviews, things like that. That's already a pretty credible threat because it does make these things public. Now, whether you saying that you're going to tweet your 70 followers that this company was evil, maybe not going to be effective, but if an attorney is backing that up, maybe it is going to give some teeth to it.
Yeah, I mean, the bigger picture, the bigger question here in a negotiation skills sort of podcast isn't how to make a great threat. It's like whether or not you can interweave that into the negotiations overall. And I have a much lighter approach to threats. I'm not big on threatening to sue people or anything like that. And if I do have to do it, I like to keep it subtle in the sense of, that's a claim that we would have against you. And we would win on that claim which is one of the things that you mentioned. But for me, it's just a very, very subtle thing. Rarely am I going to make open threats to somebody unless I'm willing to follow through with it.
And there certainly is a time and place for that. And there's certainly clients who request that specifically, right? We
Right.
want you to go to war over this. We're ready. We have money in our coffers to take this to litigation. We want to make clear that this is a very realistic threat.
And I think I've done that before, and it's fine, and I guess it can work in some situations. What I'm thinking of is sometimes my client will be trying to do a deal with another client, right? Two business people are trying to do a deal together, and I'm only brought in or involved if they need a bad cop. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. That's part of my job. I would rather be involved from the beginning for full negotiations, but it is something that's there. It is a tool in our toolbox.
Yep. And I think lawyers can be very good bad cops. I think people are surprised when they come in and we suggest, hey, maybe us being good or neutral cop here might work better.
Yeah.
But it really comes down to the specific circumstances.
Well, I'll take even one better is I'm thinking of a particular client right now where I am the good cop. And it's a lot of, hey, he really wants to push towards litigation and spend a bunch of money on this. I've talked him out of it. And in fact, not just this client, but other clients have said, you're my business guy and I've got litigation guys. Right. And so I'm the good cop. I tell the opposite side, hey, look, you're talking to me because we're trying to strike a deal here. But as soon as it goes to so-and-so, his litigation attorney, it's over. So I've even been good cop, too.
Mm-hmm. Which do you prefer, Peter?
I think I prefer to be good cop. I think where I'm most useful in litigation is sort of academic and tactical for a litigation thing. I'm not going to yell and scream and stomp my fist. I'm going to tell somebody, I'm going to beat you. I'm going to convince a jury or a judge that we're more reasonable than you. And then you're going to pay my client a lot of money. You know what I mean? I'm not going to put on the war paint, so to speak, and hoop and holler and all that.
Fair enough. I'm definitely more inclined to go with the good cop side, but boy, it can be fun to be bad cop sometimes. Mm-hmm. It can be really fun to get on the phone and be the guy who's just threatening to grind them into the ground.
Right.
But it really depends on the circumstances and what's best going to help your client in any given situation. And it may be that you run the full gamut during the course of a negotiation. You start off as a good cop with the subtle, hey, we need to get this resolved or this may be a problem. Here's why it'd be a problem. And by the end, you do end up in that sort of more threatening posture of this needs to be resolved or you're going to have serious consequences.
Right.
So I think there's a time and a place for everything. And it comes down to just understanding the other side, understanding their needs, and finding ways to reach a middle ground that works for everybody.
I think you mentioned context, and context is an important theme. And whether you're good cop or bad cop, or whether you start that way or end that way or whatever, might be a piece of how you contextualize the negotiation as a whole.
Thank you so much for listening. Again, I'm Alexander Theo Harris.
And I'm Peter Smith.
If you need more assistance, feel free to reach out to us. We're at apexlg.com, and we'd be happy to hear from you. Thanks.